5% Human by J. Wilburn. The last thing Cooper said to her before going to check the traps by the river was, "I love you." It was as good as any final words could be. Sorry, give me just a second here. I want to get my notes in place. Made him feel high to say it and have her say it back, but even that did not seem to be enough to redeem the day. The snares were empty. A couple sly animals had nipped the bait without setting off the traps. Capper rebaited them and hoped for the best. He was kneeling at the first nets in the river, but never saw if there were any fish in them. Downstream, a young girl's voice cried out in shrill pain or fear. It could have been both. "Help me. Someone please help me." Capper stood and took a few steps toward the cry of distress, like any person of goodwill would. Then he stopped, the exact same words repeated in the exact same tone. He cursed under his breath and ran the other way along the river, hoping he wasn't too late to avoid this fate. Capper wanted to head back to the caves and warn the others, but he did not want to lead the monsters to his people. If he could just put some distance between himself and whoever might be checking the traps, then there was still a chance. He had decided that he would stop on the other side of the next tree to catch his breath and find some cover for a little while. Again, like many things he planned that day, he never got to see his plans through. He felt the pressure plate give under his feet. All the strength gave out under his legs before any sort of nerve shock took him down for real. As he lay paralyzed and shaking upon the trap in the scattered leaves, the lure sounded again under him this time. "Help me, please help me." This time it was the quivering voice of a little boy. This close to the speakers, he could hear the electronic distortion behind the computer-generated voice. That was the sound of the devious monsters who hunted this world. Capper realized with some regret that he was dumber than the woodland animals who had nipped his bait without getting caught. Their footsteps were heavy as they approached. He wanted to close his eyes and block them out, but he had no control over his eyelids. His body was numb, but he thought he could feel that he had wet himself inside of his buckskins. These creatures wore metal and plastic protection. Oh, thank you. I appreciate the cheer there. It means a lot. Footsteps heavy. His body was numb. These creatures wore metal and plastic protection over their giant bodies and misshapen heads. From the dimensions and proportions, Capper believed these were the ones everyone called squid heads. A squid was a creature from the ocean. Capper hadn't visited the ocean for many years since he was very young, before the world was invaded by monsters from the sky. They loaded him into a cage and checked the other traps they had left along the riverbank. Finding no one else as dumb as Capper to get caught like this, they took up their traps and loaded everything, including Capper, into their ship. At least they removed the other traps, so maybe the people he cared about would be safe for a little while longer. Maybe the girl he dared to say he loved would benefit from his mistake instead of suffering. There could always be hope, he supposed. It was hard to believe it when he was stunned, covered in his own urine, and quivering in shock. Capper knew he was in the air because he had seen their ships from below his entire life. It felt like a long journey, but he had no point of reference for such things. He knew he had ridden in cars and even an airplane once when he was very young, but his memory on those things was vague. It was almost the memory of other people telling him about it. They hauled his cage on a levitating platform through impossible white hallways. Other creatures of all shapes and sizes and colors passed on both sides of as Capper floated through the passages. The strange garble of alien language was exchanged as he hovered in place. One of the creatures walked away through Capper's narrow view. The guy was almost skin-colored on one half of his body, but the other half was so jet black that it was hard to see any detail. He wondered what the point was of such colorations. His buckskins had dried, but he smelled his own urine from when they trapped him. The rest of the building he passed through almost had no smell at all. The air was cool, like late fall or early winter. Occasionally they passed glass windows that overlooked a vast city of light, metal, and motion. Capper was not without imagination. He had things described to him before. He had images in his head from books and movies early in his life. This was still a difficult scene to process after so many years living in the woods and caves and hiding. The impression he did process well was of being very high up, like on a cliff, but much higher than anyone he had seen out in the wild. These were structures built by the monsters from space. Okay. They had truly claimed his world as their own. Anyone who could build this would have no trouble rounding up and finishing off the rest of the people in his group and any others that still lived on Earth. As he was distracted by the structures outside, the glowing ships zipped by, and the shimmering lights around high curved walkways, he did his best to focus on the blue, yellow, and orange swatches of sunset beyond this great and terrible city. He was almost able to enjoy it, maybe his last sunset alive, but then he realized another shape stood in front of those windows, enjoying the same view. It was so tall, thin, and featurelessly ebony that Capper had missed him at first. It was the creature that his people called a Slenderman. Maybe one of the most viscerally terrifying to Capper's people. His cage entered a closed white box. Capper felt certain this would be the last time he ever saw the outside world. The cage opened and he cowered to the back. Alien voices garbled back and forth to one another. A computerized voice, not disguised even as well as the lures that trapped him, said, "Step out of the holder. You won't be harmed." When he did not comply, the message repeated exactly like before. After a third communication, mechanical arms reached in for him. They reminded Capper of terrible claws. Capper burst out in a rush and crossed the room in a full run. The walls were curved and the corners not well defined. With everything one bright color, he misjudged the distance and smacked his head on the wall. As he tumbled to the smooth, cool floor, the cage, a squid head without protective coverings this time, a tall green monster Capper had never seen before, backed out of the room. They kept their large, dark eyes on him, and he got the impression that they were somewhat afraid he might attack, but he had no intention of going near them. The door sealed like it was part of the smooth, seamless wall, and he was in a stark white chamber all alone. A computerized voice said, "You are safe. You will not be harmed. You will be fed and cared for. Your cooperation and compliance are appreciated. We are friends." Capper sniffed at that last bit about friendship, smelling his own pungent urine stink again. He curled into a ball where he had fallen and cried himself to sleep. He had no clear feel for how much time had passed. The light that seemed to come from every surface brightened and dimmed through a repeated cycle. For a while he tried to count to see if it matched day and night outside, but he quickly discovered such a thing was not possible. Without the sun, time was whatever his captors decided it was. He opted not to speak, not in response to the computerized voices and instructions, not to himself as he fought against the madness of boredom, isolation, and sensory deprivation from the empty white curves of his prison. He would give them no words. Capper had no idea how this helped him or hurt them, but he was going to maintain that much control, that much protest. Food was delivered through slots in the walls and that folded down to create raised, flat surfaces for him to eat. He knew there was a word for that, but he couldn't remember it. They served him what he assumed was meat, but he could never identify what type. It was always dull and flavorless. The vegetables were different varieties. Some sparked a memory from his days before the invasion, but he could not recall their names, and he never asked his captors any questions about the food. Sometimes his meals were warm, sometimes they were cold, even when they were the same vegetables or meat from earlier. There was no pattern that he could figure out. Water was available any time he would say the word water. They had trained him to do that, but he refused. He just slapped the wall where it came from. All right, hold on just a moment. Where it came from until they opened it for him. It popped out of the wall in a spout arcing into a shallow pool. When he pulled back from drinking, the fountain folded back into the wall. If he spilled any water on the floor on purpose or by accident, it absorbed dry and was gone. That was the same way they trained him to handle his wastes. He just dropped them anywhere and they vanished into the floor, whether they were solid or liquid. He sometimes banged the wall for water to clean himself, but he refused to take his buckskins completely off. He feared they might disappear into the floor as well. Over time, the shape of the room changed. Surfaces to sit on and lay upon formed. He found those softer than even the pallets that they made for themselves in the caves. He always wondered about the fate of his friends, and especially her, the one he dared to love, and to tell her about it. For all he knew, they were in rooms just like this all around him. That thought depressed him. He had long ago lost count of light and dark cycles when the door opened and she walked in. Not the one he loved, not even a human she. This she was something else entirely. Capper cowered against a back wall and stared. She sat down on one of the surfaces closer to the door. He waited for her to do something, but she didn't say anything or make any moves after sitting down for the first several visits. Capper would watch the open door and wait for someone else to come, but no one ever did. She looked more human in her features and in her shape than the others. Her skin was a light bluish color that made her appear cold or sick. When she stood, she was a bit taller than the average human, at least any Capper had ever seen. Her blue head was completely bald. Her clothing over her almost human female shape shimmered like the city he had glimpsed on his way in here. He would startle each time she stood, but then she left without a word and the door sealed again. One day he decided he was going to try to flee the room the next time the door opened. She entered like before, but this time the door closed behind her. He wondered if they could read his thoughts. How much harder would that be than building this place or absorbing his waste through the floor, really? He almost started laughing as he thought about a room underneath this one where all that stuff dropped. He managed to hold in his giggles as he watched her, now closed in this space with him. What did this mean? She sat down like always, but Capper stood and moved along the wall opposite her. He finally abandoned his protest and spoke. What do you want? His voice sounded weird in this room and inside his head. The words were rusty and congested. After they were out of his mouth, he wasn't sure they were real words at all. To help the humans, she answered in a perfectly uncomputerized voice. Her accent was odd, but the words were clear. His voice was barely above a whisper as he spoke again. What are you? I'm a worker here, and part of the effort to help the human species to survive. I'm a friend. Capper spit out a curse he had often heard but seldom used, then followed that up by saying, You're no friend. I am a friend, she said flat, like stating an obvious fact. I'm not here to hurt you. We are trying to help, and we will continue to do so even if you are upset with us. That is a friend. Capper shook his head. I've been held here for I don't know how long. 23 days, she said, counting the day you arrived. He took several deep breaths. Finally, he sat down on the soft surface he used for a bed. That seemed too short of a time, but he had no idea if she were lying or not. He wasn't sure what they gained by lying about that. He wasn't sure what they gained by holding him here either. Why did you bring me here? She said, the human species is dying out. We are making an effort to bring you back. Why don't you just take me back to... He stopped short, thinking about his friends. He worried he might give away their hiding place. Maybe that was what this was all about. He was not stupid, but he was not sophisticated either. He understood they could manipulate him, but he sensed he lacked the ability to stop them if they really wanted something from him. She had not been aggressive toward him, though. Maybe that was part of the trick. I am a friend. His head hurt trying to make all these twisted turns inside his mind come together in a way that made sense to him. We know about your den. We've not taken any others since we brought you, she said. You know where we live? Of course, she said. There are 40 of you in all, 29 female, 3 pregnant. He just stared and then growled out, leave them alone. His fists opened and closed, but he wasn't sure what he could do with them if he decided to strike out. We're not trying to hurt you. We are trying to repopulate the planet with your species. Then leave us alone. She stood and backed across his bed. She stood and he backed across his bed. The door opened and she said, I'll be back soon and we can talk more. The conversations continued. He started asking questions about the invasion of Earth. She gave him some details. Much of it, even though she spoke everything in his language, was beyond his understanding. Maybe if he had gone further in school before everything ended, he would get more of what she was saying. The part he did understand was, in her view, at least as far as she told him, that mistakes were made. Monsters who oversaw the invasion, she called them overseers, but not a word he knew, were removed from power, and efforts were made to save the remaining humans alive. It all sounded like excuses to him. My family was killed. My mother, my father, my brothers, and sister, everyone I knew and can barely remember now. That's what you did. That was before my time. I was captured and held here in your time. After this, she walked out yet again and stayed away for a few cycles. More than once she asked if he would like new clothing. He declined every time, even though what he was wearing was starting to smell and itch no matter how often he washed up from the on-demand fountain. He had given up on silence. He was going to hold on to this much protest. He started saying water instead of banging on the wall when he was thirsty. One visit, she said, I am able to crossbreed with humans. What? He really didn't understand what she meant. My species is compatible with yours. What does that mean? It means I can be impregnated by a fertile human male. You are a fertile human male. The resulting offspring would be stronger and more resilient than a natural purebred human. Capper shook his head. Is that why I'm here? Is that why you're here? It is. It can be accomplished by taking a sample via mechanical means, or we can engage in intercourse and procreate that way as well. It's up to you. Your willing participation is preferred. It's for the good of your species. I am a friend. Most of my friends don't offer this, he thought. He stared a long moment as she waited on him to respond. Capper asked, Do you see me as an animal or as a person? She took a moment before answering. I don't see the difference. Maybe you can explain your question more. I think you just answered it, he said. She remained silent again, as if that were the end of the issue. I want to go back to my people, he said. We won't do anything until you are comfortable, but it is important that we continue this effort to save your species. Your willing participation is preferred. I am a friend. Friends don't hold people captive. We are doing this for the good of... Shut up. Stop arguing how you're my friend and not my captor. You could leave the planet and let us have it back. That would be helping. She said, I'll leave you and return at another time after you've had time to... I don't need time, he stood up. The door opened and she stepped out before it closed. It was several cycles before she returned. When she did, she tried to talk to him about other things, but he said, I want to go back to my people. I want you to leave us alone. Your den and the others around the world are maintained in protected areas. These preserves are off limits to development. Your species is procreating naturally, but not at a rate that will stave off eventual extinction. He stared a moment, and his eyes lost focus as he thought about what she had said. Wait, you just watch and keep us around where we are living like a zoo? She considered and then said, more like a natural preserve. We are trying to preserve and repopulate your species. It is desirable to keep a certain number healthy and in the wild as we make efforts to raise the population numbers elsewhere. He just stared at her again. Finally, he stood up and the door opened. What are you afraid I'm going to do? He asked. I don't understand what you mean. Every time I move, the door opens and you leave. I'm powerless here. What are you worried I might do? We just don't want to agitate you. He shook his head. Hold on just a second. Sorry. Okay. He shook his head. Not holding me captive would be a good start. He stood up. She stood up. We find with a little sleep and food you tend to calm down. You're trying to have sex with me, he said. How calm are you really trying to get me? She waved a hand and the door closed. She motioned at herself. Are you ready to have sex now? No, I don't want to have sex with you. Would you prefer to be introduced to other potential partners or to employ mechanical means of collection? No, what are you talking about? We need to crossbreed your species to create more resilient stock. We find that reaching a level of about 5% human DNA after enough breedings is ideal. Any more tends to punctuate flaws in your genetic code. A few humans have been introduced into civilized areas with minor success. Hybrids do better. With enough generations, we believe that human DNA can be introduced to the general population successfully, preserving the legacy of your planet and species across this planet and the many worlds. It will keep you from being lost entirely. I thought you were trying to save us, he said. She stared a moment and then sat back down. We are, but your genetic code has too many flaws to overcome naturally from the diminished populations your species has reached. You also show a lack of adaptability to the current conditions you face. We are going to preserve your genetic code through crossbreeding before the natural population is extinct. He had no idea what to say. Am I ever going to be allowed to return to my people? She took a deep breath, which seemed a very human response to him, and said, there probably won't be any of your people left after much longer. You should want to help with this effort to preserve a portion of your legacy. Can I be introduced into the civilized world? You're not ready for that. You may never be ready for that. Don't be upset. Most of your species is not and never will be. Generations after you will be integrated into the many worlds with success. He turned away. I want you to leave now. He heard the door open again behind him. He had lost count of how many times she asked the same question. She asked again before she left. Would you like some clean clothes? No. Why do you find me not find me attractive like this? Are you asking if I would have sex with you right now? Because no, just leave. She stepped out and the door closed again. He looked around the chamber, but found there was nothing really to look at. He knew she would be back. This was his life, and he wasn't sure what it all meant. He decided the next time she was here, he would ask for fresh clothes. He would ask for them instead of letting her ask if he wanted them. That would be his way of holding on to some control. That much protest.